I'm not going to lie. This is something I thought would not be happening at West Ham United anytime soon. But a week in football is a long time. And only a week ago, we heard that David Sullivan was stepping away from the operational side of things at West Ham. And if you watch my video a few days ago about Daniel Kretinsky, you know we spent a lot of time discussing Kretinsky's potential takeover ambitions at the club and whether there were any. At the time, there were still plenty of unanswered questions. Was Kretinsky genuinely looking to increase his influence? And if so, what route might he have taken to do so? Would the Gold family be willing to reduce their stake and sell to Kretinsky? Would Kretinsky buy out David Sullivan's stake? Well, we've received answers to those questions where West Ham's ownership story is now at. Because on Saturday, it was confirmed that Daniel Kretinsky is indeed increasing his stake in West Ham United to approximately 43% after agreeing to purchase shares from the Gold family. And as I said, I don't think this is something I really saw happening. I thought we'd be forever stuck with David Sullivan for two main reasons. One, because he would find a way to wriggle out of the personal issues he's facing, and two, because I just never thought Daniel Kretinsky would have enough interest in making a move to be the major stakeholder at West Ham. And look, I'm so glad I'm wrong on both counts. As far as Sullivan's concerned, things keep mounting against him, which now seem to be an avalanche of accusations. As far as Kretinsky's concerned, maybe he was biding his time, knowing the crap that was coming Sullivan's way. And for the first time since David Sullivan became involved with West Ham, somebody else will now own a larger share of the football club than he does. Now, make no mistake about it, this is quite monumental in the history of West Ham United. Not because it's a full takeover, not because Sullivan is immediately leaving, but because this is the first time that the balance of power has shifted away from him towards somebody else. And that somebody else happens to be billionaire Daniel Kretinsky. Now, look, this raises important new questions. What does it mean for the future ownership of the club? What does it mean for the Gold family? What does it mean for David Sullivan? And what does it mean for transfers and the way that this football club is going to be run from this moment on? Now, the first thing that struck me about this announcement is that people are treating it like a simple share transaction. Kind of, but I'm not so sure. The Gold family didn't really have to sell their shares to Kretinsky. They could have held on to them. They could have sold to another investor. They could have waited. Instead, they've chosen Daniel Kretinsky. Now, I think it's quite significant. We know that the Gold family shares have been on offer for 3 years. And one of the things I said quite some time ago was I didn't think anybody was going to invest in the football club without them having a proper say in the club. They were willing to sell 15% of their shares, but it would have meant that somebody outside buying in wouldn't have had a lot of influence in how the club was run. So that's quite significant then that it's Daniel Kretinsky, because Kretinsky's got 27% of the stake already. And by increasing his stake to 43%, it means it's quite significant, because what the Gold family have effectively done is that they've actually placed their trust in Kretinsky's vision for the future of this football club. Remember, David Gold's family has been connected to West Ham for years. And Vanessa Gold herself, she understands the club. She understands the supporters, the opportunities, and the challenges that we've been facing. So for the Gold family to deliberately increase, and agree to increase Kretinsky's influence at the club is a massive vote of confidence in him. They know, or they're hoping, that the club is now in good hands. The Gold family is not disappearing. They've still going to have 9% remaining of shares. So they still have a meaningful stake and a voice in how the club is run. But what they've effectively done is to help create a new power structure at West Ham United. A joint statement was released on the official website on Saturday. And the wording of the statement itself indicates that all the shareholders are supportive of this arrangement. People like Trip Smith have already said the Gold family and all the other minority shareholders are in support of this change. All but one, that is. David Sullivan's name was mentioned, but not necessarily in support of Kretinsky gaining the biggest stake in the club. Now, before anyone starts accusing me of reading too much into that, let me be absolutely clear. We don't know what's happened behind the scenes. We don't know whether Sullivan fully supports this move or not. We don't know if he opposes it. We don't know whether he's just simply accepted his fate. What we do know is that when the majority ownership changes, every word in the statement is carefully chosen. Nothing appears by accident, and the absence of Sullivan's name is interesting because it implies he's had no control of what's happened. He's had no influence. The backing and the support of the Gold family is gone, and the backing and support of any of the other shareholders at West Ham, for that matter, is also gone. In my eyes, this is a clear message from the board members stating that enough is enough when it comes to the era of David Sullivan's rule. So what does this mean for David Sullivan now? Well, if anybody cares, for years, Sullivan has been the dominant force at West Ham. Under him, there was constant turmoil when it came to how the footballing side of things were being done. Change of managers on a regular basis, directors changing, recruitment strategies changing. One bad decision after another was made. But Sullivan remained the central figure despite all this. But despite him no longer having the largest sharehold, he still has significant interest tied up in this football club. He still owns 38% of his 38% of shares. But the reality is he no longer holds the strongest position. He can't damage the club anymore with his bad decision making. So what is Sullivan's long-term plan? Does he remain involved? Does he gradually reduce his stake, knowing now that the other shareholders are backing Kretinsky? He no longer has that power. He can't no longer have the likes of the Gold family supporting him. So what does he do? I think we're going to see him probably either reducing his stake in the club or to negotiate a complete exit. And I think the latter will happen. I think because of what's happening around him, I think we will eventually see David Sullivan selling his shares. Because I can't see him remaining now what is a minority shareholder whilst Kretinsky's influence grows. Look, nobody outside the boardroom knows what Sullivan is going to do, but the general consensus now is that Sullivan will either willingly or even be forced to completely sell up. Now, here's another angle that everyone has just started to talk about. I've seen a lot of supporters saying that Kretinsky is bringing in his own people into West Ham. But the reality is he's already had his own people at the football club for quite some time. The most notable is Pavel Horsky. Horsky has represented Kretinsky's interests and has been heavily involved in financial oversight and corporate governance matters. His role has been to understand the club from the inside, to understand the numbers, to understand the opportunities, and to understand the risks. And that's important because it tells us this isn't someone who's just rushed to make a takeover. This isn't someone like Kretinsky suddenly deciding that he wants to take the club over. Kretinsky has spent years studying West Ham from within, learning the club, how the club operates, learning about the stadium situation, learning about the commercial opportunities or the lack of them, and learning about the financial challenges that this club face. And perhaps what we're seeing now isn't the beginning of his plan. Perhaps it's the next stage of a plan that's been developing for several years. That should make supporters sit up and take notice, because Kretinsky now has the largest share and he won't be arriving at this club blind. Let's talk about the finances, because I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire story. Over recent months, We've heard concerns about staying within PSR boundaries. We've heard concerns about cash flow. We've heard concerns about how we need to cut our cloth accordingly, especially when it comes to buying and selling players. That's the narrative we've been constantly fed from the club, from David Sullivan and Karen Brady. Yet something interesting happened recently because West Ham's accounts were signed off on the 31st of May without the need or the request for a short extension beyond that financial year end. Some clubs, a lot of clubs, usually ask for that signing off of accounts to be done on the 30th of June. But West Ham didn't take up that option. And when you're constantly being told that there are financial pressures at the club, that is quite surprising. So it does raise the question, has fresh funding already been arranged? Have shareholders provided additional support? Has the club's short term financial position all of a sudden improved? What we do know is that West Ham don't currently look like a club preparing for financial emergency. So that kind of leads me to think, and I mentioned this in the show I did the other day, that it looks as if Kretinsky has already invested further capital into this football club that could completely change the landscape yet again. Because investment doesn't just improve finances, it can have a massive influence on things like our transfer window, which opens on the 15th of June and closes on the 1st of September. If there's one thing supporters immediately think when they hear about new investment and changing ownership structures is this: does West Ham still need to sell players? For months, we've heard speculation surrounding some of the club's biggest assets. Jared Bowen's name inevitably continuously linked with interest from elsewhere, as has Matthias Fernandes and Crescencio Somerville's names. In fact, there's hardly a player in the senior squad who doesn't seem to have been linked with a move away from the club. But if the announcement of Kretinsky taking the largest sharehold and injecting much needed cash funds into the club is anything to go by, it leads to a wider financial stabilization plan, which can change the narrative on our transfer plans and can mean that the need for a quick fire player sale no longer needs to happen. Transfer negotiations and decisions can be made from a position of strength. And that is a huge difference because there is a world of difference between choosing to sell a player and being forced to sell a player because of our financial predicament. Now, West Ham may be able to retain players that they would otherwise have thought that they had to cash in on. Look, don't get me wrong. I've no doubt we will sell players, but now we're not desperate for the money, whereas during Sullivan's era, we were stealing from Peter to pay Paul. If West Ham genuinely want to bounce straight back into the Premier League, keeping the likes of Bowen and many other players becomes one of the biggest statements they could make. At this moment in time, players are looking for positive signs. How ambitious is West Ham going to be for getting back into the Premier League at first attempt? They want to see stability. They want to see a sign that a club has a plan. The new board announcement potentially sends exactly that message. And I've got a feeling that we'll be seeing more players probably staying at West Ham than any other time. For the first time in a long time, West Ham may well be in a position where they don't have to weaken their squad in order to survive financially. And promotion could be one of the most significant consequences of this entire ownership shift. But perhaps the most fascinating question of all is what happens inside the boardroom, because ownership change is one thing, how a football club is run is another. One of the reasons Daniel Kretinsky has been successful in football with Sparta Prague of late is the structure he's put in place around him. At Sparta, footballing decisions are delegated to specialists, not to David Sullivan and Karen Brady. I've always said about Karen Brady that, she was always good on the business side, but absolutely awful on the footballing side. Whereas with David Sullivan, he was just awful on the footballing side and on the business. How did he make his billions? Well, we know. But anyway, So at Sparta, football decisions, as I've said, are delegated to specialists. There's a clear sporting structure, there's accountability, and there's long term planning. And crucially, this isn't one individual trying to make every major footballing decision. So, could West Ham eventually move towards a similar model? Could we see the appointment of a sporting director? Could we now see a director of football coming in? Will there be both or will there be one? I don't know. Could recruitment, player development, analytics, long term squad planning all be brought together under a more footballing structure? The recruitment and data analytics team at the club have already been told they won't be losing their jobs, which is a seismic shift in how Kretinsky wants to manage our transfer strategy moving forward. With Kretinsky ultimately gaining greater influence, supporters won't just judge him on how much money he's going to invest, how much money he's going to spend in the transfer window. They're also going to judge him on the people he appoints and the business structure that he now puts into the club. The most successful football clubs aren't necessarily the ones that spend the most money. Sure, it helps massively, but they're also the ones that make the smartest decisions. And perhaps that's where the biggest change could eventually come. Not necessarily through huge transfer fees, but not necessarily through blockbuster signings, but through creating a footballing operation that's better organized, better planned, and better equipped to compete over the long term. For years, supporters have been talking about the need for West Ham to modernise its footballing structure. The possibility now exists that Kretinsky could become the man who finally delivers that. And for the first time in a long time, there appears to be a clearer picture emerging at West Ham. A major investor increasing his stake, boardroom support, potential future investment, long-term strategies taking shape. And if Kretinsky can convince players that West Ham still has ambition despite our relegation, that can prove just as important as any transfer of players coming in. It could help retain key players. It could help attract new players, and it could help build confidence throughout the football club. But perhaps the biggest takeaway from Saturday's announcement is this. 3 days ago, 4 days ago, we were discussing whether Daniel Kretinsky's takeover ambitions were realistic. Today, I don't think that's the question anymore. Quite clearly, it's not. The real question now is how far does he intend to go with West Ham United? Because becoming the largest shareholder isn't something you do by accident. Increasing your stake isn't something that you do by chance. Spending years learning the inner workings of the football club isn't something that you do just as a matter of interest. All these pieces appear to be moving in the same direction. And whether that eventually leads to full control of West Ham by Kretinsky remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. Today represents the biggest shift, or Saturday represented the biggest shift in power we've seen at West Ham United for many years. The Gold family has backed it. The board appear supportive. Kretinsky is stronger than ever. And David Sullivan is no longer the dominant force at the club. That doesn't mean the takeover story is over. If anything, I think it's only just getting started. And perhaps the announcement isn't really about ownership at all. It's about succession planning. For years, supporters have asked what West Ham would look like with David Sullivan not being there. We've received our clearest indication yet of what the future holds. What are your thoughts? Are you in support of this? Are you happy that Kretinsky has now taken over and made his move? Do you care about what happens with David Sullivan next? And is this the start of a new era at this football club? Look, if you've enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Please hit the bell notification for the next show. Please hype the video as well. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to me rant on for quite some time. And I'm sure I'll be back again very, very soon.